In a quiet European village tucked between misty hills and stone bridges, there stood a chapel so old, its walls whispered the prayers of generations. But one stormy night in 1975, 4 devoted nuns walked into that chapel to pray, and were never seen again. For decades, their names became nothing more than fading ink on the parish registry. Until, in 2008, a new priest made a discovery so chilling that the entire village has refused to speak of it since. Before we dive into this haunting mystery, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because today's story will take you deep into a secret the church tried to bury. Now, let's begin. In the far reaches of northern Europe, where stone villages cling to the edges of misty hills, stood a parish that had outlived plagues, wars, and the slow decay of time. It was called Saint Aurelia's Chapel, a place so old that even the oldest villagers said their grandparents had prayed there as children. Its thick, moss-covered walls and narrow windows made it seem as if it had grown from the earth itself. The chapel's bell tower rose like a silent guardian over the valley, its bronze bell cracked from centuries of ringing, its sound hollow yet strangely comforting. The chapel was both the heart and the ghost of the village. Everything happened under its shadow. Weddings, funerals, baptisms, even rumors. And at the center of it all were 4 nuns whose names were once known by every soul in the region. Sister Margaret was the eldest and the leader of the convent. With sharp blue eyes and a face carved by years of prayer and penance, she was a woman who believed obedience was the only path to holiness. Children feared her silence more than her words. Villagers often said that when she prayed, the candles flickered lower, as if afraid to interrupt her devotion. Sister Beatrice, the healer, was her opposite. Her hands were soft, her voice like the hush of falling snow. She tended to the sick, cared for the elderly, and was said to know every herb and flower that grew within 10 miles of the chapel. To the poor, she was a saint. To others, she was too kind for a place that demanded so much suffering. Then there was Sister Helen, younger and more curious than the others. She had joined the convent in her 20s after leaving a teaching position in the city. Her mind was restless, always reaching beyond scripture for meaning. She often asked questions about the parish's history, the underground passages, the sealed door behind the altar, and the Latin inscriptions that even the priest refused to translate. Those questions were never answered. Lastly, Sister Agnes, the newest and youngest, barely 22, was seen as a light within the cold walls of Saint Aurelia's. Orphaned as a child, she found solace in the convent, in its order, its silence, and in the sisterhood that replaced the family she'd never known. She was gentle, trusting, and devout, though sometimes she admitted that the chapel frightened her after dark. "It feels like it's listening," she once said. The other sisters told her it was only the wind. Their lives followed a rhythm as precise as the ticking of the chapel's ancient clock. They rose before dawn, knelt for morning prayers, and spent their days in service, washing clothes for the poor, teaching children catechism, baking bread, and keeping the chapel spotless. At night, they gathered in the candlelit choir loft and sang hymns so haunting that travelers passing through would pause to listen, crossing themselves before continuing down the road. But as peaceful as their lives seemed, the chapel carried secrets, old ones. There were whispers among villagers that Saint Aurelia's had been built atop a pre-Christian burial ground, and that the church's foundations were not entirely holy. Strange carvings were said to exist in the stone beneath the altar, hidden beneath layers of plaster. Some even claimed to hear chanting long after the chapel doors were locked, echoing from the earth below. By 1975, the village had grown quiet. The younger generation had left for cities, leaving behind the elderly and the faithful few who still attended Massachusetts. The parish priest, Father Benedict, had fallen ill and left for treatment in another town, leaving the 4 sisters to tend the chapel alone. For the first time in decades, there was no priest to lead them. Only silence. That summer, the weather turned unpredictable. One morning, the sky was clear. By evening, clouds would gather like bruises. Then came the storm, the kind that darkened the village for days. Rain fell relentlessly, flooding the roads and trapping the inhabitants inside their stone homes. The old bridges swelled with water. The church bell, heavy with moisture, refused to ring. Inside the convent, the sisters prayed by candlelight. The wind howled through the cracks in the chapel's stained glass, and thunder rolled across the hills like the growl of something ancient. Food was running low, and the oil lamps flickered weakly. Then, on the third night of the storm, the sisters gathered in the chapel. Sister Margaret led them in a final prayer before midnight, one that none of the villagers would ever forget. A witness later claimed that he saw the chapel doors open briefly, letting out a flash of candlelight and the faint outline of the 4 nuns walking inside. The doors closed again with a heavy echo, and that was the last time anyone saw them. By morning, the storm had passed, and the chapel stood silent. The doors were locked from the inside, and the candles had all burned down to wax puddles. When villagers knocked, there was no answer. When they called their names, the only reply was the hollow echo of their own voices. No one knew it then, but Saint Aurelia's had just become the stage for one of Europe's most chilling unsolved vanishings, one that would remain a whispered legend until 33 years later, when a new priest uncovered what truly lay beneath those ancient stones. When dawn broke over Saint Aurelia's the next morning, the storm had finally passed. The air hung heavy with the scent of wet earth and smoke from the villagers' hearths. The chapel stood silent, its roof dripping with rainwater, its wooden doors slick and dark. For the first time in living memory, the morning bell did not ring. At first, no one thought much of it. Perhaps the sisters were simply resting after the storm. But as hours turned into a day, and a day into 2, unease began to spread. The convent's windows remained shuttered. The garden gate, which was always open for beggars and children, was latched. Even the pigeons that usually perched along the chapel's eaves seemed to avoid it. By the 3rd day, the village baker, Thomas Renard, decided to check on them. He brought a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, as he did every week. But when he knocked on the convent door, the sound echoed back at him, hollow and strange. He called out to Sister Beatrice, then to Sister Margaret, no answer. He tried the door, but it was locked tight. He walked around the chapel, calling their names through the windows. Everything was still, unnaturally still. That's when he noticed something odd. The candles in the chapel were still burning. Through the stained glass, he could see a faint, amber flicker. The candles had burned for 3 days without being replaced. That was impossible, unless someone was still inside. By nightfall, a small group of villagers gathered outside the chapel. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered that perhaps the nuns had gone into deep retreat, locking themselves inside to pray. But a few older residents shook their heads. "That chapel," one woman murmured, "has never let anyone leave willingly once it takes them in." When Father Benedict's temporary replacement, a traveling friar named Father Matthias, finally arrived the following week, he was informed that no one had seen the 4 nuns since the storm. Matthias was a practical man, a skeptic by nature. He insisted that the sisters must have sought shelter elsewhere. Still, he agreed to open the chapel and search. The villagers stood back as he approached the massive oak doors, a ring of iron keys clinking at his side. The lock turned stiffly, as though it hadn't been moved in years. The hinges creaked in protest. When the door finally swung open, a rush of cold, stagnant air spilled out, the kind that smells of dust and something older. The candles inside had all burned out, their wax melted down the altar steps like frozen tears. The pews were in perfect order. The hymn books were still neatly stacked. There was no sign of struggle, no trace of intrusion. Only an eerie silence that clung to the air like a presence. Father Matthias called out their names, his voice echoing up the stone arches. "Sister Margaret, Sister Beatrice, Sister Helen, Sister Agnes." Only his own echo replied. He walked through the aisles, examining every corner. On the altar lay 4 rosaries, placed in a perfect line, as though arranged deliberately. Each cross was cold to the touch. Behind the altar, A narrow door led to the small vestry where the sisters kept vestments and relics. Inside, he found 4 folded habits laid neatly on the wooden table, and nothing else. That discovery silenced the crowd outside. Word spread quickly, reaching every home in the valley by nightfall. The 4 sisters of Saint Aurelia's had vanished. The regional authorities were called in from the nearest town 2 days later. They arrived in black coats, carrying lanterns and notebooks. But the investigation was brief and inconclusive. There was no evidence of forced entry, no footprints in the mud, and no bodies. It was as if the nuns had simply dissolved into the air. The only detail noted in the official report was that the chapel floor near the altar appeared slightly sunken, as though hollow beneath. But when the investigators suggested breaking through the stone to search below, the parish caretaker refused. "It's sacred ground," he said. "You don't disturb what's beneath." The idea was dropped, and the mystery was left to rot with time. 4 years, Saint Aurelia's remained closed. The new priest arrived, stayed a few months, then left. Parish records show that between 1975 and 1980, 5 priests transferred out of the chapel, each citing unsettling atmosphere as their reason. Locals began avoiding the place entirely. Some said they heard footsteps when walking past after dark, as if someone were pacing just inside the locked doors. Others swore they saw candlelight flickering through the stained glass on moonless nights. Children dared each other to touch the chapel doors, but none stayed long enough to do it. The surrounding gardens grew wild. Ivy consumed the stone walls, climbing up the bell tower until it looked like the forest itself was reclaiming the building. The once clear stream that ran behind the chapel turned murky and still. It was as though the land around Saint Aurelia's was holding its breath. In 1979, a visiting historian named Dr. Laurent Devereux came to the village to document old European churches. When he visited Saint Aurelia's, he was immediately struck by the chapel's strange symmetry. The stained glass patterns didn't match any known religious design. Some panels, he claimed, resembled symbols older than Christianity, circles intertwined with serpents, suns framed by thorns. When he mentioned this to the remaining villagers, they asked him politely to leave. "We don't speak of that place anymore," one elderly woman said. "Those who pray there do not return." And so the parish faded further into silence. The chapel's doors remained locked, the key stored somewhere in the diocese archives. For 33 years, no priest stayed long enough to reopen it, and no villager dared to enter. But the story of the 4 missing nuns never truly died. It became a ghost tale whispered to children, a warning about faith and curiosity. Until 2008, when a new priest named Father Adrian Keller arrived, determined to restore Saint Aurelia's to its former glory. What he found when he broke the seal of the chapel doors would unearth a truth that had slept beneath the parish for over 3 centuries, and shake the foundations of everything he believed. The disappearance of the 4 nuns at Saint Aurelia's was not treated as a miracle or a curse, at least not at first. It was treated as a scandal. In a country where the Church still held quiet authority, the notion that 4 sisters could vanish under its roof was deeply unsettling. Officials wanted answers quickly, but answers refused to come. 4 weeks after the storm, teams of investigators combed the village and surrounding hills. They searched the nearby woods, the riverbanks, and the crumbling ruins that dotted the countryside. Posters with sketches of the nuns were nailed to trees and tavern doors. But as the days passed, the leads grew cold. Every villager had the same story. They saw the sisters walk into the chapel the night of the storm and never come out. No one could explain how 4 people could disappear from a locked building, especially one made of stone walls thicker than a man's arm. The first clue came from the bell tower. When investigators climbed to the top, they found something strange, a single candle stub placed near the window ledge, burned halfway down. Next to it lay an open hymnal, its pages stuck together from dampness. The hymn was marked with a faded finger smudge beside the words, Lux aeterna luc et eis. May eternal light shine upon them. It seemed almost like a farewell. Father Matthias, the friar who had opened the chapel, became increasingly uneasy. He claimed that on several nights after the search began, he heard faint singing coming from inside the chapel, though it was empty and sealed. The melody was slow, mournful, and in Latin. When he reported this to the diocese, they dismissed it as exhaustion. But locals whispered that the sisters' voices were still echoing through the walls, that their souls were trapped, still performing their nightly prayers. One evening, about a month after the disappearances, 2 local boys decided to test the legend. They sneaked into the chapel through a broken cellar window behind the convent garden. What they found inside was not what they expected. The air was colder than outside, unnaturally so. Their lanterns flickered weakly as they crept past the pews. Dust floated in the candlelight like drifting ash. On the altar, the same 4 rosaries still lay untouched, their silver crosses glinting faintly. But when the older boy reached out to touch one, he froze. He swore he heard whispering, a woman's voice, right behind him, murmuring in Latin. He dropped the rosary and fled, tearing his sleeve on the pew. The younger boy stumbled after him. When they crawled out of the cellar window and looked back, they both saw something that neither would ever forget. For candles had been lit inside the chapel, and no one was there to light them. By morning, the cellar window had been sealed shut by order of the parish caretaker. The boys refused to speak about it again. One of them, years later, confessed to a journalist that he never entered a church again. The church's official investigation concluded in late 1976, declaring the case unsolved. The final report stated only, "No signs of abduction or flight. Premises secure. Conclusion: disappearance under unknown circumstances." The parish records listed all 4 sisters as missing, presumed deceased. Their personal belongings were stored in a wooden chest beneath the vestry: 4 habits, 4 prayer books, and a diary belonging to Sister Helen. But that diary soon vanished as well. No one could say who took it, but some believed it contained details about the secret passages beneath Saint Aurelia's that Helen had once questioned. By 1977, the convent had fallen silent. The village priest who replaced Father Matthias refused to live on the grounds. He rented a room in town instead, visiting the chapel only for Sunday Mass, and even then, he never stayed past dusk. He told close friends that he felt watched while standing at the altar, as if someone was standing behind him, whispering words he could not understand. The villagers followed his unease. Where once the chapel had been a place of life, it became a symbol of dread. Children were forbidden to play near it. Travelers who passed through often remarked on the strange quiet that hung around Saint Aurelia's. No birds perched on its roof, no vines grew across its walls, and no sound of bells was ever heard again. It was during this time that rumors began to circulate among nearby towns. Some said the sisters had performed a forbidden ritual. Others whispered about a hidden crypt beneath the chapel, one that predated Christianity, a remnant of the pagan cult that had once existed in those hills. There were even stories that the 4 sisters had uncovered something buried beneath the altar, something the church had long forgotten or chosen to forget. In 1981, a young seminarian researching parish disappearances came across the Saint Aurelia's case. His name was Victor Moreau, and he was fascinated by the idea of sacred sites built over older pagan ground. He visited the village briefly, collecting testimonies from anyone willing to talk. But when he tried to obtain the chapel keys from the diocese, his request was denied. 1 week later, he left the village abruptly, abandoning his research. Friends said he returned home, a changed man, pale and withdrawn. He never published his findings, but in a letter to a colleague years later, he wrote, "The parish sleeps upon something ancient. The ground hums if you listen long enough." That was the last anyone heard of him. By the late 1990s, Saint Aurelia's was a ruin of its former self. The paint had peeled from the walls, the pews warped with dampness. The chapel bell had rusted into silence. Yet, despite the decay, No one dared demolish it. Even the diocese seemed content to leave it untouched. But in 2008, after years of neglect, the church sent a new priest, Father Adrian Keller, a man young enough to believe he could restore what others feared. He was devout, curious, and unafraid of the old stories. "If there are answers here," he told the local paper, "then the truth will only strengthen faith, not weaken it." The villagers warned him not to open the chapel. He smiled, thinking their fears were superstitions. But when he unlocked those ancient doors for the first time in over 30 years, he said later that the smell inside nearly made him sick, a mixture of incense, mold, and something that reminded him of burnt wax and iron. And deep beneath that smell, he said, there was something else, something sweet, faintly like roses, but rotting. It was the scent of something long buried. Father Keller had no idea that what he was about to uncover would become one of the most unsettling discoveries in the Church's modern history, one that would draw attention from theologians, journalists, and even the Vatican itself. When Father Adrian Keller arrived in the small village of Saint Aurelia, he was 35 years old and full of conviction. He had been educated in Rome, known for his intelligence and compassion. His mission was simple: to reopen the chapel, restore the parish, and bring faith back to a place long forgotten. But as he stepped off the bus that autumn morning in 2008, the villagers met him not with joy, but with silence. Old men sitting outside the cafe stared at him as he passed. Women crossed themselves. One whispered something in the local dialect that he didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, a warning. The chapel stood at the end of the cobblestone lane, half hidden by overgrown vines and brambles. Its once white walls had turned gray, streaked by rain and age. The doors were heavy, the iron handles cold. Father Keller paused at the threshold, reading the inscription carved above it. "In tenebris lux, in darkness, light." He smiled faintly. "Light," he murmured. "That's exactly what we need here." Inside, the air was thick and damp. His flashlight beam cut through decades of dust. The pews were covered in cobwebs, the crucifix above the altar blackened with time. A Bible lay open on the lectern, its pages curled and brittle. When he touched it, the spine disintegrated into powder. As he walked toward the altar, something shifted underfoot, the faintest echo, as if the floor were hollow beneath him. He knelt, pressed his ear to the stone, and listened. There was something, a faint hum, a resonance, like the slow beat of a heart far below the surface. He pulled back quickly, dismissing the thought. Perhaps it was just water running beneath the foundations. But the sound lingered in his memory, growing louder each night. That evening, he returned to the rectory, a small cottage beside the chapel that had been abandoned for years. Inside, he found boxes of old records, baptism logs, marriage certificates, and faded letters. One envelope caught his eye. It was sealed with red wax and stamped with the parish insignia, a cross encircled by a serpent. Inside was a short, unsigned note, written in French. "Do not open what has been sealed." The sisters obeyed, but faith was not enough to save them. "Beneath the altar, the light does not forgive." Father Keller read it twice, then carefully folded it back into the envelope. He didn't tell anyone about it. The next day, he began cleaning the chapel. He worked alone. None of the villagers would help. They told him they had other work, that the chapel was cursed, that it was better left to crumble. But he was determined. As he swept dust from the altar, his broom caught on something, a small crack in the stone. Kneeling, he brushed the debris aside and found a metal ring embedded in the floor. It was the edge of an iron handle, almost invisible beneath centuries of wear. When he tugged, it didn't move. It was sealed tight. He made a note of its location, planning to return later with tools. That night, the first whisper came. Father Keller woke around midnight to the sound of faint singing, soft, distant, feminine. The melody was unmistakably sacred, but the words were unclear, drifting in and out like voices underwater. He rose from his bed and followed the sound through the rectory and into the chapel. The air was freezing cold, his breath visible in the beam of his flashlight. The singing stopped as he opened the door. He swept the light across the pews. Empty. The altar glowed faintly with reflected moonlight through the stained glass. He approached it slowly, and saw something that made him step back. 4 candles stood on the altar, their wicks blackened as if recently burned. But he hadn't lit them. In fact, he hadn't even placed them there. Trying to calm himself, he whispered a prayer and returned to bed, telling himself it was fatigue, imagination, or perhaps a prank by local youths. But deep down, something inside him knew the truth. He wasn't alone in that chapel. Over the next few days, strange things continued to happen. Objects moved. The chapel doors, which he locked each night, were sometimes found ajar in the morning. Pages in the Bible turned on their own. Once, when he entered at dawn, he found the words Lux aeterna lucit eis scratched faintly into the altar cloth, the same phrase found in the nuns' hymnal decades earlier. Determined to find answers, he visited the diocese archives in the nearby city. There, among dusty ledgers and forgotten files, he discovered the official investigation records from 1975. Most of the pages were mundane, statements, inventory lists, floor plans, but one entry caught his eye. It was a note from Father Matthias, dated October 12, 1975. The floor beneath the altar is false. I hear sounds at night, whispers, prayers in a tongue I do not know. I fear what lies below. The sisters must have found it. Beneath that note, in red ink, someone had written one word. Closed. Father Keller copied the entry and returned to Saint Aurelia's that evening. He brought with him a crowbar and a lantern. The chapel was silent, save for the occasional creak of its wooden beams. He placed the lantern on the altar and knelt beside the iron ring he had discovered earlier. Taking a deep breath, he wedged the crowbar beneath it and pushed. The metal groaned, and then lifted slightly. A gust of air rushed out, cold and dry, carrying the scent of old earth and decay. He froze. The space below was pitch black, a narrow opening leading into darkness. Holding the lantern close, he peered down. Stone steps descended into what looked like a hidden chamber. He whispered a prayer, lowered himself into the opening, and began to descend. The steps spiraled downward for several meters before leveling off into a small crypt. The walls were lined with carvings, not of saints or angels, but of circles, serpents, and suns, the same symbols Dr. Devereux had described decades earlier. At the center of the crypt stood 4 stone alcoves, side by side. And in each alcove, something rested. They were skeletons, dressed in fragments of decayed black fabric. Rosaries hung loosely from their bony hands. Father Keller's lantern flickered as he approached. On the wall above them, carved in Latin, were the words, In lumen peribimus, in the light, we perish. The realization hit him like a blow. The 4 missing sisters had never left the chapel. They had been buried beneath it, sealed away intentionally. But who sealed them? And why? He stumbled backward, shaking, whispering prayers. As he turned to climb back up, he heard it again, that same faint humming from the stone itself, rhythmic and alive. And beneath it, 4 voices, barely audible, singing the same ancient hymn. The light of his lantern flickered once, then went out. Father Keller didn't remember how he escaped the crypt. When he came to, it was morning. The first light of dawn spilled across the chapel floor, illuminating the broken seal beneath the altar. His hands were covered in dust, his lantern shattered beside him. He staggered to his feet, trembling, his mind fogged with disbelief. Had he really seen what he thought he'd seen? 4 skeletons, the singing voices, the carvings, it all felt like a nightmare bleeding into daylight. But when he looked again, the evidence was still there. The iron ring still lifted easily, and beneath it the stone steps yawned downward, waiting. He didn't descend again, not alone. Instead, He ran to the village, demanding to see the mayor and the police. At first, no one believed him. The mayor, a gray-haired man named Lucien Moreau, scoffed. "That chapel has been sealed since before you were born, Father. There's nothing down there but rats and rot." But when Keller insisted, showing the villagers his dust-stained robes and the old note he'd found, they finally agreed to follow him. By noon, a small group of men, the mayor, 2 officers, and a local historian, entered the chapel. The air was tense and heavy. The villagers stood outside, praying, refusing to go near the door. Inside, the group pried open the hatch once more. They descended carefully, flashlights trembling in their hands. And there they saw it, just as Keller had described. 4 alcoves. 4 skeletal remains. Each adorned with the remnants of a nun's habit, rosary beads still intact, and an ancient crucifix clasped in bone. The historian, Professor Etienne Rousseau, approached the carvings on the walls with awe. "These symbols," he murmured, tracing the serpent looped around a sun, "they're not Catholic. They're pre-Christian, older than the parish itself." He pointed to the Latin inscription above the remains. "In lumen paribimus." Then he turned to Keller. "Do you understand what this means, Father? They weren't praying to escape darkness. They were afraid of the light." The discovery made headlines across Europe within days. News outlets called it the Chapel of the Vanished Sisters. Archaeologists, clergy, and journalists flooded the small village, turning the quiet parish into a media spectacle. The diocese immediately sealed off the crypt, claiming it was a sacred burial site. But rumors spread faster than the church could contain them. Some said the nuns had discovered an ancient pagan chamber beneath the chapel and performed a forbidden ritual to keep it sealed. Others whispered that the light they feared wasn't metaphorical, that something luminous, unnatural, lived beneath the earth. Father Keller tried to keep the focus on faith and healing, but each night he found it harder to sleep. The whispers returned. The faint hymns floated up from the chapel floor long after it was sealed. He began recording them, faint, echoing melodies that his recorder picked up even when he couldn't hear them himself. One night, he played them for the local bishop. The bishop listened for less than a minute before abruptly shutting it off. "Destroy these tapes," he said firmly, "and speak of this to no one. Whatever lies beneath that chapel does not belong to us." But Father Keller couldn't let it go. He began studying the parish archives, piecing together the fragments left by Father Matthias and the 4 sisters. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The sisters had found something beneath the chapel in 1975, something that defied the teachings of their faith. Their journal entries hinted at dreams of a blinding radiance beneath the stones, and of a chorus of voices calling them downward. One note, written in Sister Helena's trembling hand, read, "We tried to pray it away, but the light listens. It answers." In November 2008, Father Keller vanished. The parish caretaker found the chapel doors open one morning, the iron hatch beneath the altar removed. A single lantern lay beside it, burning weakly. Keller's personal Bible rested on the altar, open to Psalm 23. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." He was never found. The diocese sealed the chapel once more, this time permanently. A new marble slab was placed over the altar with an inscription that read, "For those who served in faith and silence." No priest has since been assigned to Saint Aurelia's parish. The rectory remains abandoned, and the villagers avoid the chapel grounds altogether. Even now, locals say that on certain winter nights, when the fog is heavy and the church bells of nearby towns echo faintly through the valley, a choral hymn can be heard drifting from beneath the earth, 4 voices in perfect harmony. In 1975, 4 devoted sisters entered their chapel to pray, and were never seen again. For decades, their disappearance was dismissed as rumor, a small-town legend meant to keep children from wandering too close to the abandoned parish. But the discovery in 2008 revealed a truth stranger and darker than anyone imagined. For nuns entombed beneath their own altar, symbols older than the church itself, and a priest who vanished after uncovering the secret. The parish of Saint Aurelia remains silent now, its doors sealed, its walls cold. Yet, for those who dare to listen on quiet nights, the whispers of the sisters still sing their final hymn.